Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Murrell here with another edition of Charts with Dan. I'm recording this in the aftermath of Team USA's loss to Belgium in the round of 16. It was not the way I wanted to see the USA go out, both on and off the pitch, but I am still very proud of them. I think they did a great job, and good luck to everyone still in the tournament. That England-Mexico game was one of the best games that I've ever watched. But let's turn our attention from the World Cup to the box office. And while it may have been a weekend to remember at the World Cup and at the America 250th birthday celebrations, it was a box office weekend to forget, largely because July 4th fell on Saturday. So let's look at the top 10 for this past weekend. At number 1 was Minions and Monsters with a much lower than expected $37 million and a $62 million total since it opened last Wednesday. It was being clocked for at least $80 million over the 5-day weekend before it opened, and we'll talk about why it may not have done well in just a few minutes. Toy Story 5 ran a much closer than expected second place with $30.3 million, dropping 57.2%. It now has a $365.6 million domestic total. In third place was Young Washington from Angel Studios at $19.3 million. Initial reports had it as the company's highest ever live action opening weekend, but once the actual numbers came in, it dipped just below Sound of Freedom's first weekend. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. Supergirl, yikes. 76.8% drop in weekend number 2 for an $8.6 million 3-day weekend. Its domestic total is $57.4 million. It was one of the worst weekends ever for a movie in 3,000 or more theaters, which we're going to look at. But for everybody that was saying it was too early to proclaim whether Supergirl was a hit or not, this is a catastrophic second weekend. I mean, with the reviews and everything else, you have to have expected this to be on its way, but a 76.8% drop is very bad. Yes, exacerbated by the overall slowdown at the box office, but still just no good news for that film. Disclosure Day, actually one of the only movies in the top 5 that held decently well. It only dropped 30.3%, but it was just for a $5.7 million weekend. It's now over the $100 million domestic mark. In sixth place was Obsession. In its 8th week of release, it finally drops out of the top 5 with a $5.2 million weekend and a $245 million domestic total. Just behind it is Backrooms, which also held very well. It dropped 24.5%, probably because there was a new edition of the film with extra footage that was put out into theaters, so there was probably some repeat business, people going back to see it, but it didn't really boost it that much. It brought in $3.3 million. It's got a $190.4 million total. Jackass Best and Last lost 67.7% off of its low opening last weekend for a $2.7 million weekend and a $14.7 million domestic total. Scary Movie dropped 62.6% for a $1.1 million total. This is probably its last weekend in the top 10. And at number 10 was The Invite, which expanded really only to a handful of theaters, but had a 111.2% increase due to the increase in theater count. It brought in about $800,000. It will be expanding into much wider release this upcoming weekend. Dropping out of the top 10, we have The Mandalorian and Grogu out after 6 weeks, Masters of the Universe out after just 4 weeks, and Bleach, 1,000-Year Blood War, The Calamity, which was really a special event, out after just 1 week. That is not unusual, especially for these anime preview theatrical events. Looking at the biggest theater count changes this past weekend, The Death of Robin Hood pretty much went out of theaters completely in its third weekend. It lost 1,478 theaters and remains in just 102. So that was the one that cleared the most theaters for the Minions. Not far behind, though, was Masters of the Universe, which dropped 1,170 theaters. It's now out of wide release and now in just 920 theaters. Scary Movie dropped 846 theaters. It's now in 1,158. The Mandalorian and Grogu dropped about half of its remaining theaters. It's now also out of wide release. It's now in just 575. And Disclosure Day dropped a chunk of theaters. It dropped 655 theaters. It's now in 2,702. As far as how this weekend stacked up against the same weekend last year, we were down from the 2025 box office, which has been the exception to the rule. Last year saw the opening of Jurassic World Rebirth and a more favorable schedule as far as the July 4th holiday. It was on Friday instead of Saturday. So we were down about 23.2% from the same weekend last year. But again, not catastrophic, especially considering we have a few different box office disappointments, and we'll see how July recovers from here. As I said on last week's show, I don't expect July to be as much ahead from where we were last year as June was, but then I think we're set up really well for August. As far as the summer box office so far this year, there were no changes this week. There are a few kind of brimming under the top 10, but right now everything stays in the same spot with Toy Story 5 now far and away the number one movie of the summer. It's $365.6 million. Obsession is in second place, followed by The Devil Wears Prada 2, Backrooms, and The Mandalorian and Grogu. And this list should get shaken up a lot more when we look at it next week. As far as my picks for the summer, I have not yet officially eliminated Supergirl because it's not mathematically eliminated, but it will be in a week or two, so that's going to be a miss for me. And Minions and Monsters, as you can see, I picked it to be the fourth highest grossing film of the summer. It is definitely not going to be up that high, and we'll see how far it actually drops down this list. So I think that's going to be another pretty big miss for me as far as my predictions go. And I'm worried that Moana may also be a big miss for me. It's opening this upcoming weekend. I predicted it to be the third highest grossing movie of the summer, but I have not really heard much buzz at all about this film. And I know that there's already a lot of skepticism about it. So my summer box office predictions aren't looking fantastic right now. I basically have Toy Story locked in at number one, but it might be replaced by Spider-Man Brand New Day. And everything else below it is just kind of messy. So we'll see how this goes as the summer goes on. All right, so let's talk about Minions and Monsters. If you tune into the channel regularly, then you were probably as surprised as I was that this was actually the only Minions movie that not only could I tolerate, but that I actually kind of enjoyed. And that wasn't isolated. This had by far the best critical ratings on Rotten Tomatoes by many degrees. I think it had only the second highest rating as far as Metacritic goes. So it seemed like the Minions had finally cracked the formula, something that would entertain families and also not drive people like me insane. And of course, that means it was not just the lowest opening for a Minions movie, it was the lowest opening for any Minions or Despicable Me movie, and by quite a lot, by almost $20 million behind the 3-day opening weekend of Despicable Me. Now, we'll look at 5-day openings for Illumination in a minute. These are the 3-day openings, but several movies, including Minions and Monsters, opened on Wednesday. But still, for it to have the lowest opening in the franchise and yet be the only one that I actually enjoyed, pardon my French, but what kind of monkey paw bullshit is this? Finally, I have a Minions movie that I love, and I even sarcastically predicted it in my review. I said, oh, well, I guess because I loved it, that means everybody else is going to hate it. And this was the movie, if you look at Cinema Score. All of the other Minions movies, except for I think Despicable Me 3 got an A Cinema Score. This one got an A-. The Rotten Tomatoes audience scores are pretty low when you look at it compared to the franchise. And other things like the post-track score and measurements of whether a movie is getting word of mouth were way lower than the other movies. So it seems like Minions and Monsters, yes, was able to finally please critics, but then it didn't please audiences. I guess they want garbage, just noise and chaos and empty calories and nothing else. I suppose when you train people to expect that, then when you give them something more, they say, well, what the hell is this? This isn't a Minions movie. It's good. It has a story and a plot. That's not why I come to see these films. Anecdotally, my nephew went to go see it, and the report that I heard back from him was that the first half of the movie, which I liked the most because, as I mentioned, it had a story and plot and kind of clever jokes, was kind of boring. And then it was better in the second half, which I didn't like as much because it was just kind of mindless noise and chaos. So I guess audiences want from the Minions mindless noise and chaos. It could also be that this was, I think, the third Minions or Minions adjacent film that we've gotten in the last 4 or 5 years, with Despicable Me 4 and also Minions: The Rise of Gru. So there could be some franchise fatigue. And obviously the fact that Saturday, which is a major movie-going day, was July 4th, where probably almost nobody was going to the movies, would have impacted the overall 5-day weekend. The story, I think, on this is really going to be written next weekend, this upcoming weekend, when we see how well the movie holds at the box office. Were there families that were just waiting to go see this because they were busy on July 4th weekend, or are they going to skip it entirely? Being out this close to Toy Story 5 certainly doesn't help it as far as the family crowd goes. And we have Moana opening this weekend, another movie that wants to draw a family crowd. So it seems like perhaps Universal and Illumination had a lot of faith in Minions in thinking that it could compete in the family marketplace. Now, the saving grace here is that, as with all other Illumination movies, the budget on Minions and Monsters was responsible. It was made reportedly for about $85 million, and then you add marketing on top of that. And it did well internationally. So it's going to be a profitable movie, but it's not going to be an ATM like the other movies have been. But it just go figure. The one that I actually like and say, oh, I wish they made more of that one, Illumination is going to be disincentivized in every possible way for making another one like it. That's just rich irony. It does feel like I wished on a monkey paw and the finger went down and it said, okay, they'll make a great Minions movie and nobody will like it. This is what the franchise tracker for Illumination looks through when you track the first 5 days. So for some movies, it would be the Wednesday through Sunday box office. For those that open on Friday, this would be Friday through Sunday, and then you throw in Monday and Tuesday. Now, Minions and Monsters is a little higher on this list. It's at number 12, but it's still behind Despicable Me back in 2010. And this is before you even factor in inflation. And look at it. It did, what, less than half of what Minions: The Rise of Gru did 4 years ago? It did about half of what Despicable Me 4 did 2 years ago. Obviously, there's something at play here. What was the July 4th factor? We will see, I think, this upcoming weekend. But just a disappointing weekend for Minions and Monsters, and one that I don't think a lot of people saw coming. Sometimes you don't know what audiences want, what they're going to watch or not watch, until the tickets actually start being sold, because I don't think anybody would have predicted a box office downturn for the Minions this steep and this quickly. But there is precedent for an animated film opening on a July 4th weekend where July 4th falls on a Saturday. Those combinations don't happen very much. But we have to go back to 2009, and that leads us to our Charts with Dan trivia question for this week. Back in 2009, the third entry in an animated franchise opened on Wednesday, July 1st, and went on to make $66 million over the 5-day holiday weekend. What I want to know is, what was it? What was it back in 2009 where July 4th also fell on a Saturday? What part 3 of an animated franchise opened on Wednesday and made about the same as Minions and Monsters? I'll give you a second to think about it. You can pause if you want more time. The answer is Ice Age: Dawn of the Dinosaurs. Now, again, of course, you would have to factor inflation in as far as a dollar for dollar figure, but it opened with about $66 million, and it ended up having about 3x legs. Its final domestic total was about 3 times its opening weekend. That, however, was the third Ice Age movie. It didn't have a parent franchise like Despicable Me that was also using the characters, and it was a different movie going time. And there is a little bit of precedent for some movies that opened on a July 4th weekend doing well. Armageddon back in 1998 also opened on a weekend where July 4th fell on a Saturday. It did about 4 times its opening weekend. But again, it was a different time. It was a different kind of movie. If you go back to the last time July 4th was on a Saturday, that would be 2015. Inside Out and Jurassic World held pretty well in their third and fourth weekends, but Terminator Genisys was an absolute box office bomb that never recovered from its poor opening. So we're just going to have to see what happens. And as we wrap out our Minions talk, let's look at the results from this past week's member poll. It was very simple. I just wanted to ask, Minions, yay or nay? And as much grief as I get about not liking the Minions, this was pretty overwhelming. 71% voted nay on Minions. Only 29% voted yay. So I guess I'm not as in the minority as everybody else. The irony being that I'm much more now, at least as far as Minions and Monsters go, in the yay category than the nay category. So I go from being in the majority to the minority. The world is just turned upside down. We've got so much more to go over from this July 4th box office, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for today's show, Surfshark. If you know one thing about me, it's probably that my name is Dan Murrell, but if you know 2 things about me, it's that my favorite movie is Jaws. And that's why today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN, is a perfect fit. Much like the dark waters of the ocean, you never know what's lurking in the depths of the internet, but with Surfshark, you get one tool to protect all aspects of your life online. I spend a lot of time doing box office research online for this show and others, and if I'm not connected to Surfshark, it seems like the same ads just keep following me around no matter where I go. That's because even if you're just browsing at home, every website you visit and every link you click leaves a digital footprint. With Surfshark VPN, my IP address is masked, making my online activity hard to track. And if you do a lot of online shopping, websites can track your activity to target you with ads and even give you different prices. Surfshark's ad blocker blocks those ads and trackers to help you get the best deal. Cybersecurity is a big deal, and the last thing that you want is to be tracked, targeted, or even have your information stolen. With one easy-to-use app that covers all the devices in your household, Surfshark is here to make sure you can use the internet in peace without worrying about being stuck in the jaws of anyone who wants to track you. You can go right now to surfshark.com/Murrell and use the code Murrell to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN at checkout. That's surfshark.com/Murrell, Murrell, with the promo code Murrell to get 4 extra months at checkout. With Surfshark, you're going to need a bigger internet. All right, let's turn to the second biggest story at the box office this past weekend, and that was the catastrophic second weekend drop of Supergirl. We talked a lot last week about its very, very underwhelming box office opening weekend, and it continued that same trajectory in weekend number 2. Let's look at the second weekend drop-offs for movies that opened in 3,000 or more theaters, and Supergirl is in 6th place by 0.01%. So it had a 76.82% drop on its second weekend. That comes in just behind Mortal Engines, which is in 5th place all time, which dropped 76.83%. Still, you don't really want to be in this kind of company. Now, not every movie here was a flop. Five Nights at Freddy's, for example, was a low-budget film. It was a streaming day-and-date release, and it opened to like $80 million. So it was a profitable film. There was a sequel. 50 Shades of Grey, also profitable. It spawned 2 sequels. But the thing to note about Supergirl is that other than the re-release of Spider-Man No Way Home, which is there in 9th place, and Mortal Engines, all of the other films on this top 10 opened higher than Supergirl, including Joker Folie à Deux. As I speculated on last week's show, the actuals for Supergirl last weekend came in lower than Joker Folie à Deux. But yeah, a catastrophic second weekend for Supergirl, as the opening was in many ways catastrophic. And let's take a look at where it stands financially. These are my profitability estimates for Supergirl. Again, this is given theatrical grosses only. So this is theatrical profitability, not overall profitability. Theatrical profitability. How much is it going to lose in the theatrical window? The reported budget on the film, $175 million. I saw a quote saying that $120 million had been spent by Warner Brothers on advertising as well as distribution costs. So that puts the cost of the film up to $295 million. It has yet to crack the $100 million mark globally. I estimate, given the box office returns we have, that the net income on the film is $50 million, a little bit over $50 million, which means when you deduct that from the costs, right now, I'm looking at Supergirl today with a theatrical loss of $244.3 million. Even if you take that $100 million in market value that I've seen quoted, the people saying that, like, well, it got $100 million basically of marketing credit from all these brands. Even if you write that cost down against the theatrical loss, that's still a loss of $144 million theatrically. This is going to be a massive money loser for DC and for Warner Brothers. And I saw that the blame game has already started. The Hollywood Reporter article has come out and talked about the creative squabbles behind the scenes, which is what you often see when a movie doesn't do well. There is no rosy financial picture here. There's no way to spin this. There's no way to say, well, it's a success if you look at it this way. There have been attempts with that on Mandalorian and with Masters of the Universe, but there's no angle where you can approach this where Supergirl is anything other than not just a box office disappointment, but a box office catastrophe. And we'll see what DC does from here. Looking at some of the other movies in the top 5, Toy Story 5 is now one of Pixar's top 10 moneymakers ever at $365.6 million. It's closing in on Finding Nemo. And then if it can get to $415 million, it'll enter the top 5, replacing Toy Story 3. When you adjust those numbers for inflation, Toy Story 5 is the 16th highest grossing film in Pixar history. It's about $25 million behind A Bug's Life. And then if it can break that $400 million mark, it can try to pass Monsters University, as well as the first Toy Story movie, the first Cars film. It would need to get up to $480 million to crack the top 10. Currently, that spot is held by The Incredibles, so we'll see what it does in the days and weeks ahead. Also, Angel Studios, as I mentioned, just barely missed out, again, by about $300,000 on having its top live action opening weekend ever. The top opening film in Angel Studios history is the animated film David, back from last December at $22 million. Then we have Sound of Freedom in the second place spot with $19.6 million. But that movie opened on Tuesday. So that was the opening weekend, but it had been open on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, before that 3-day gross even kicked in. So its box office total was significantly higher than that after its first 3-day weekend. Young Washington we see there in third place at $19.3 million, which is just ahead of The King of Kings by only about $1,000, which that's a razor-thin margin at the box office. That film came out back last April. Then there's a pretty big drop-off before we get to Cabrini, Solo Mio, Homestead, His Only Son, The Last Rodeo, and After Death. Now, as I often see with Angel Studios releases, there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there about how they do their ticket sales and that they were empty theaters and that nobody actually went to see the film and all of these different things. And I understand that their business plan is unconventional. It's a little opaque. It opens the door to scrutiny. But I will just tell you, again, anecdotally, a lot of the people, especially on social media, et cetera, that were saying, well, I looked at seats in my local theaters and that nobody was booked in to see it. So these must be fraudulent. A lot of those people are based in large metropolitan areas. I'm telling you, I was based here in Arkansas. I was looking at the seats and how many were sold for each screening, and it looked like a movie to me that opened to around $20 million. Of course, that leads to sub-conspiracy theories about like, well, yeah, they sold the tickets, but nobody actually showed up. These conspiracy theories can get a little exhausting because I think sometimes Occam's razor does apply, and it could just be that there are people that go to see movies that maybe you don't like. You don't like the studio, you don't like the subject matter, etc. A lot of what Angel Studios puts out doesn't fall into my area of interest either, but I don't think that they're putting out some massive money laundering conspiracy like some people do. I think that there are just different interests, and they're often centered away from the major metropolitan areas because, again, looking at tickets sold, at least where I am, it matches the performance of this film. At least I think so. Taking a look at Obsession now, it has passed My Big Fat Greek Wedding to become the third highest grossing film to never spend a weekend at the #1 spot at the box office. If it can make another $25 million, it'll be where Sing is at #2, but I don't see it getting up to where Oppenheimer is at that #1 spot at $330 million, but it's been fun to watch it climb up this chart. It stays at #5 as far as the highest grossing horror films of all time domestically, unadjusted for inflation. It's about $11 million away from passing I Am Legend to get that #4 spot, but Backrooms has passed A Quiet Place to become the 9th highest grossing horror film domestically, unadjusted for inflation all time. So the summer of horror continues at the box office in summer 2026. And the big release this upcoming weekend, there are a few hitting theaters, but the tentpole release is, of course, Disney's live-action remake of Moana. There are a lot of people who hate all the Disney remakes. There are a lot of people who like some of them. So when it comes to our member poll question for this week, what I want to know is, what is your favorite Disney live-action remake? And I will let you decide if The Lion King counts. If you don't want to count it, that's fine. If you do want to count it, vote for it. But I'm not going to make the determination here. I'm going to let you do some of that work. So comment right now on the member poll what your favorite Disney live-action remake is. If your answer is already there, please upvote your answer instead of leaving it again. That makes the results easier to tally, and I will reveal those answers next week on Charts with Dan. All right, let's turn now from the domestic box office to the international box office, which is all markets outside of the US and Canada, and look at the top 5 films. #1 was Minions and Monsters. As I mentioned, it did fairly well internationally. It made $85 million over the 3-day weekend. That is technically a 721.5% increase because it was open in a few markets last weekend. So this won't count as the opening weekend, but it's an $85 million international weekend. That comes in ahead of Toy Story 5, which made another $69.3 million internationally. That's a 22.2% drop. So it's showing good holding strength, especially on a weekend where we had the World Cup going on and a whole lot of other things. The July 4th celebrations weren't a distraction, but internationally, obviously the World Cup is still a major attraction. Obsession still holding well internationally. It dropped just 11.5% to bring in another $12 million. In fourth place was a Chinese film called Keep Real, opening at just over $10 million. It's a superhero movie about a hero assembling his own super team. The Chinese box office, outside of Pegasus 3, has really not had a breakthrough hit this year, and it doesn't look like this one is going to be the one either. Backrooms also held well internationally. It dropped 15.7% for a $9.6 million weekend. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with our domestic numbers, we get the top 10 movies worldwide. At number 1 was Minions and Monsters at $122 million officially over the 3-day weekend. It's made $160.5 million globally, and that's where the $85 million budget really comes into play, because with the strong international performance, it's going to be a moneymaker theatrically. It's just not going to be as big a moneymaker as we're used to. Of course, that's over a 1,000% increase, again, from last weekend where it was open in just a few markets and made about $11 million. Toy Story 5 impressively made another $99.6 million for a $763 million global gross, so it looks like it's cruising toward $1 billion. Michael, by the way, is also very close to $1 billion, and I'm keeping track that by the time we do the show next week, Michael may be $1 billion grosser. It's out of the top 10 right now. Young Washington, just through its domestic opening weekend, is third place at $19.3 million. Supergirl didn't hold any better internationally than it did domestically. Overall, worldwide, it had a 71.3% drop in its second weekend to bring in $18 million. And as we mentioned, it has yet to crack the $100 million global mark. Obsession dropped a combined 26.3% globally for a $17.2 million weekend. It's now over $400 million worldwide. Golly, this movie is amazing. Backrooms dropped 17.8% for a $12.9 million total and a measly $349.7 million global total. Both of those movies are incredible as far as what they've been able to achieve globally. Disclosure Day dropped 35.7% for an $11.9 million weekend. It's at $216 million worldwide. Keep Real is in 8th place at just over $10 million. Then we have another Chinese film, Crossing, at $6.1 million, and a film from India called Alpha, which opened to just over $6 million. It is an Indian action film in the Hindi language featuring a female assassin who turns on her makers. It sounds a bit like Jason Bourne to me, or at least a Jason Bourne-like take. As far as worldwide grosses for Pixar, Toy Story 5 is now a top 10 Pixar film. It has passed Monsters University. It's about $30 million behind Coco for number 8 on the list. And if it can cross $1 billion, it'll definitely be in the top 6. Right now, Finding Dory is the lowest grossing Pixar billion-dollar film. It would join a club that includes Toy Story 3, Toy Story 4, Incredibles 2, and the top grossing Pixar film of all time, Inside Out 2. All right, let's return now to the domestic box office and look at some of our specialty charts, and we'll start with the top per theater averages for this past weekend. For the second weekend in a row, The Invite leads the way. It's now in 28 theaters and had a $28,596 per theater average, easily number 1 for the weekend. In second place was Sherman's March, a 4K re-release of the film, brought in just over $10,000 in one theater. Sherman's March is a documentary from director Ross McElwee from 1986, chronicling his attempts to make a documentary about the Civil War General Sherman and how the project ends up intersecting with his own love life. A follow-up film of sorts is going to be released this month, which is probably why they did the 4K restoration. Minions and Monsters comes in third place, bringing in just over $8,700 per theater in 4,243 theaters. Toy Story 5 comes in fourth place at $7,627 per theater in just under 4,000 theaters. And Young Washington brought in an average of $7,109 per theater in each of its 2,700 theaters. So if you had a theater with all of those, you were bringing in about $23,000 on average for the weekend with just those 3 wide releases, which isn't too shabby. These were the top films in limited release, which I define as 1,000 theaters or fewer. At number 1 was The Invite in 28 theaters with an $800,000 total. It was good enough for number 10 overall at the domestic box office. Alpha in 480 theaters brought in just over $600,000. Then we have Maddie's Secret, which expanded into 85 theaters and brought in just over $200,000. A live stream of the F1 British Grand Prix in IMAX brought in a reported $200,000 from 389 theaters. That was on July 5th, so Sunday. And then Lucky Strike in its second weekend brought in about $182,000 in 389 theaters. This is what the 2026 domestic box office looks like overall for the year. The Super Mario Galaxy movie right now is at number 1. Michael currently is at number 2, but Toy Story 5 is right behind it. It moves up 1 spot to number 3. It'll be at number 2 at least by next week's show. Project Hail Mary moves down 1 spot to number 4. Obsession currently number 5, followed by The Devil Wears Prada 2, Backrooms, The Mandalorian and Grogu, Hoppers, and Scream 7. We'll see what other summer movies can crack this list. This is what the worldwide box office looks like for 2026. The Super Mario Galaxy movie, currently the only billion-dollar film, but as you can see right there, Michael is less than $9 million away from cracking $1 billion, and Toy Story 5 is also very close, so we may actually have 2 new billion-dollar movies both crossing that mark, potentially within days of each other. So we'll see if that actually happens. Toy Story 5 is up 3 spots from last week on this chart. Project Hail Mary is down 1 spot to number 4. The Devil Wears Prada 2 is down 1 spot to number 5. The Chinese film Pegasus 3 now out of the top 5 at number 6. Obsession moves up 1 spot to number 7. That bumps Hoppers down to number 8. Backrooms is currently number 9, and The Mandalorian and Grogu hanging on at number 10 at $331.5 million. So those are all the box office numbers I have for you this week. Before we go, let's take a look at the latest in streaming numbers. And we'll start with the latest numbers from Netflix. This covers the week of June 22nd through the 28th. New numbers will be released later today. And the most watched program on Netflix was the new Harlan Coben adaptation, I Will Find You, at 34.14 million views. This has not been an explosive year of viewership at Netflix, but this was one of the best viewership weeks for any show this year. Voicemails for Isabel, the Netflix original movie, also had a good second week and really its first full week on the service at 30.97 million views. At number 3 was the debut of the new film Little Brother at just over 14 million views. And then in 4th place was the second season debut of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which brought in 8.65 million views. That is a little more than a third of the viewership for the first season when it was released in February of 2024. That nearly 2.5-year gap may have had something to do with it. And I've been saying this on the show for quite a while, and now I'm seeing a lot of articles about it, about the fact that there are so many season 2s this year on Netflix that are drawing fractional viewership compared to the first seasons. And it's now becoming news. It's becoming a story. Avatar: The Last Airbender, just the latest example of that. This is becoming a thing, and Netflix may have to start examining why they are seeing such a drop in their returning shows. At number 5 is Maternal Instinct at 8.47 million views. Then we have Teach You a Lesson at just over 7 million views. Oasis Season 1 debuts in the top 10 at number 7 at 6.98 million views. This is a Spanish series about a group of teens on an island resort. At number 8 is the Netflix series Agent Kim Reactivated, which is from South Korea. You'll never believe this. It's about a former spy who returns to action to find his missing daughter. Honestly, Netflix could start their own streaming service just with content about former spies returning to action, and people could watch that for months without ever repeating anything, except, of course, that storyline. It's crazy how many Netflix shows and movies use that storyline. Husbands in Action is at number 9 at 6.28 million views, and The Polygamist rounds out the top 10 at 5.35 million views. And as I mentioned, the Harlan Coben adaptation, I Will Find You, had a great week of viewership for Netflix at 34.12 million views. It was second only to the debut week of Bridgerton Season 4, which brought in 39.72 million views, so the second best viewership total for any show this year. I like symmetry here, and this chart has a lot of symmetry. These are the most watched Netflix programs in 2026 as we know them right now. Currently, Swapped has replaced War Machine as the most watched program of the year on Netflix at 129.88 million views. War Machine is now down to 128.41 million views, followed by K-Pop Demon Hunters, Apex, and The Rip. Bridgerton Season 4 is at number 6, followed by His and Hers, Thrash, The Crash, and I Will Find You, which is now number 10 for the year at 58.16 million views total. At the end of every 6 months, Netflix traditionally has released a What We Watched chart featuring all viewership data for the first 6 months of the year. Once that chart is released, I'm going to dig through all of the data. The top 10 won't be the same here. This is just based on available viewership data. I will crunch those numbers, and eventually I will have a much better picture of the most watched programs of the year so far. Let's take a look now at the latest numbers from Nielsen. Now, unlike Netflix, these are domestic numbers only, and they're delayed by about a month because Nielsen gets to call the shots on what they do with their numbers. So this is for the week of June 1st through the 7th, June 1st through the 7th. And let's look at the top 10 movies for that week. At number 1 was the debut of Hoppers on Disney Plus with 19.35 million hours watched. That was close to one of the top 5 performances for any movie this year. It didn't quite make it, but still a good, strong debut for Hoppers on the streaming service. At number 2 is the debut of Office Romance at 10.91 million hours watched. And then we have the Angel Studios film David on Netflix at 5.75 million hours watched. GOAT is at number 4, followed by Jack Ryan Ghost War. Zootopia 2 returns to the chart at number 6 at 4.2 million hours watched, followed by The Crash at number 7 and Passengers at number 8. And I'm just kind of amused that The Crash and Passengers are back-to-back on the movie chart. Stolen Baby, The Murder of Rachel Nichol, is at number 9. And K-Pop Demon Hunters, because it's a slower week, returns to the top 10. Why not? At 2.78 million hours watched. These were the top 10 most watched streaming shows for the week of June 1st to the 7th. At number 1 was Love Island USA, which hits the charts with 21.76 million hours watched. The episodes for that show are spread across various streaming networks, which is why it says various instead of the one it currently airs on. Bluey's in second place, followed by Dutton Ranch on Paramount Plus. Grey's Anatomy is in fourth place, followed by The Four Seasons. The Big Bang Theory is at number 6. Spider Noir on Amazon spends the second week in the top 10. Michael Jackson, The Verdict, debuts at number 8 at 12.18 million hours watched. Then we have SpongeBob SquarePants and Euphoria rounding out the top 10. When you look at the shows as far as watch time per available episode, so take the number of hours watched divided by the number of episodes you can watch, that's how you get this number. Michael Jackson, The Verdict, easily leads the way since it was just 3 episodes. It generated a little over 4 million hours of watch time per episode. That comes in ahead of Dutton Ranch, which is still impressive there at 2.8 million hours of watch time per episode. Then we have The Witness on Netflix at 2.36 million hours per episode. Spider Noir at 1.54 million hours per episode. The Burrows, which has now been canceled, at 1.38 million hours per episode. And Off Campus at just over 1 million hours per episode. So 6 shows on this chart at over 1 million hours per episode. That's pretty good. The Four Seasons at number 7 with 832,000 hours per episode, followed by Euphoria at 462,000 per episode. Your Friends and Neighbors is at number 9, and The Boys, really a distant number 10, at just over 100,000 hours per episode for each of its 40 episodes. And Michael Jackson, The Verdict, had the 5th best performance for any program. When you look at it as far as watch time per episode at just over 4 million, it comes in behind Dutton Ranch's second week, which came in at 4.09 million hours per episode. Then we have Reality Check, Inside America's Next Top Model, the debut of Dutton Ranch, which brought in over 6 million hours per episode, and the first full week for His and Hers on Netflix, which brought in 6.23 million hours of watch time per episode. And those are the numbers I have for you this week. Quickly, though, I wanted to draw your attention to some things you might be interested in for the rest of the week, both in theaters and at home. First of all, today, a couple of recent movies available to either purchase digitally or do those premium video on demand, higher priced rentals. One of them is Passengers, kind of one of the overlooked horror movies of the summer. And the other is The Furious, which was one of my 10 best films of the year so far when I released that list last week. So if you didn't get a chance to see it in theaters, you can now watch it at home. On Thursday, speaking of Netflix, a new Netflix series, Little House on the Prairie, debuts. This is, of course, an adaptation of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. There was a hit 80s series with Michael Landon. Netflix is bringing it back, so it's debuting this week, and hopefully in 2.5 years, we won't have a story about how the second season drew about 1/3 the viewership of the first season. Then in theaters this weekend, of course, the big release is Moana, the live-action remake from Disney. They are not previewing this film regionally, so I will have my review of that film most likely on Friday morning. Another movie I'm excited to see, but I didn't even actually realize it was coming out in theaters this weekend, is Evil Dead Burn. I have seen no publicity whatsoever for this film, but I've heard good things about it. It's the latest Evil Dead film, and you may well see a review of that movie here on the channel later this week. Gail Daughtry and the Celebrity Sex Pass will be hitting many theaters around the country. It made its debut at the Sundance Film Festival. It is directed by David Wayne. I will say it is a supremely silly movie. It's often very funny, but also somewhat uneven. Still, I laughed quite a bit at the film, and it will be getting a pretty aggressive release for a movie of its size. Expanding into mini theaters around the country is The Invite, another movie that premiered at Sundance that I thought was much more consistently funny, and I look forward to seeing it again. Maybe I'll even do a full standalone review of that movie this weekend. We'll just have to see how much time I have. Then a couple of recent films that you can watch on streaming services. The Long Walk will be available on HBO Max, and Reminders of Him will be available starting on Friday on Peacock. And that's everything I've got for you this week, though it is a busy week here on the channel, not just with movie reviews, but the Emmy nominations come out on Wednesday morning. I have my weekly live show, then of course the Moana and perhaps Evil Dead Burn reviews, and I'm cooking up something about DC Studios, plus who knows what other crazy news might break. So if you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button, hit the bell so you know when I upload a new video. But most of all, thank you for watching this video. Thank you to my sponsor, Surfshark. Be sure to check out the description below for more about them. And be sure to check me out for more about movies. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.